Okay, so here we are continuing with Unit 4. Took a bit of a break between this one, and I'm quite tired as it's late, but we'll get on this one. Early mornings for Peter in Australia. So the next question we had to deal with was why were the Federalists able to get the Constitution ratified? So obviously there was a lot of opposition to it, and we've already talked about how the Bill of Rights had to be introduced in order to like deal with the threat of tyranny. But I'll go through the core elements to it, and then Peter will jump in and add anything if he wants to. So one of the main reasons was the poor campaign of the anti-federalists. So even though the Republic had been dysfunctional, the Articles of Confederation, I think even the anti-federalists kind of mostly agreed that the Articles of Confederation wasn't functional, but they didn't really have any alternative system. So even though they had a lot of strong arguments against the Constitution, they were mostly negative and not really productive in terms of coming up with a possible alternative. And it kind of left the idea that the only real alternative was to stick with the system that they had, and as that was pretty much universally rejected by everyone, didn't really lead to a clear alternative. I think that was exacerbated by the fact that the opposition was divided. So there were lots of people that had problems with this, but for different reasons. Like some people thought it didn't give the executive enough power. Some thought it gave the executive too much power. The smaller states obviously wanted like a stronger element towards the Senate. The more populous states wanted a stronger element towards the House of Representatives. Um, there was still that all the other divisions that we've talked about already in the country still existed, and I think they all were attacking it from different angles. And obviously, like the kind of Jeffersonian Madison base of the what would become the Democratic Republican Party was quite rural. So a lot of them were like uneducated farmers in rural areas. They didn't really have any of the key writers or thinkers on their side. So they could critique it, but they couldn't really come up with an articulate alternative. Do you want to add anything on that?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. It's also, I think it's significant that people like, well, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay, that there would be huge, there would be pretty significant divisions subsequent to the ratification of the Constitution, and yet these men were able to cooperate, work together, and put together a very powerful case in favor of it. I think that's pretty significant. I think you kind of covered that already.
Yeah, and I think so. The poor campaign of the anti-federalists was there, but as you said, there was the flip side was the strong case made on the other side. So I'll jump to that
Yeah,
one as we're kind of linking it in. So
yeah,
obviously, as you said, Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay were instrumental in drafting the Federalist Papers to defend it. I think that's instrumental because I think Madison is a key figure. Like obviously Hamilton was the driving force behind this, the idea of the governance and the idea of creating a strong executive and creating a stronger federal government, because and we'll get onto that when we deal with the divisions later on between Hamilton and Jefferson for why it was difficult to succeed Washington. But I think that Madison is a really key figure because not only was he kind of was on both sides really, because he was pro a strong federal government and really helped to set it up. But then he also realized the danger of that and therefore wrote the Bill of Rights, which was to, so I think he kind of understood maybe the opposition to this more than Hamilton did, because he knew the necessity to write the Bill of Rights. And I think that was fundamental in getting it ratified again, as we've talked about before, like that the threat of like tyranny was a real problem.
yeah. It maybe it's helpful just to clarify what the threat of tyranny means specifically in this instance, right?
Yeah, go
And
on.
that is and that is the understanding. This is from the point of view of the anti-federalists that the state constitutions states is where real sovereignty should lie. That's where that they're more representative. Um, and forming a powerful federal government risks eroding the power of the states, right? And so you form a kind of elite, some kind of de facto aristocracy that has the levers of power in the federal government, that comes at the expense of the states, essentially. And it's actually interesting from present day, as in some sense, some of the predictions of the anti-federalists, look reasonably strong from today's point of view. They're right. The federal government has expanded. And people do look at the anti-federalists today and say, well, maybe they had some of their reservations weren't misplaced. So they are the losers in the debate, I guess, in the time that we're looking at. But it's worthwhile going through some of the arguments that they make, because
I think
some
it's an argument that hasn't been. I mean, this is a battle. I mean, there's north-south divide. There's battle in these areas. I mean, one of my students was saying that if you scratch below the surface of modern day America, you see that these divides are still there. And I think that's fundamentally what's really interesting about this course and what goes on in the year that, because obviously in the year 13 course, when we deal with the civil rights, when we do the podcast, there's a lot of state versus federal. We deal a lot with the Supreme Court ratifications. And I think, I mean, Trumpian populism is really a continuation of Jacksonian democratic principles, which is really a continuation of Jeffersonian republicanism. I think you can find that thread through all of those movements.
Well, take one example. I mean, we won't talk about this too much, but just to get an idea of the nature of this debate, take the abortion argument that's going on in the US. Should rules about abortion be determined by the federal government and imposed on the states, or is it an issue that should be decided by state legislatures? So the Supreme Court ruled that it's a question that should be determined by state legislatures, but that question is there, and that's essentially, that kind of gets to the heart of the problem, the heart of the debate between federalists and anti-federalists.
And not to be too facetious or like trivialize it too much, but effectively Roe v. Wade was a Hamiltonian decision and Dobbs was a Jeffersonian decision.
That's right.
That's right. Those strains run through, even in the modern times. You've got the Jefferson strain of the let's get the federal government out of our life. They're tyrannical. They're going to force us to do things we don't want to do. Versus the Hamiltonian regime of like, we need a strong central state that is uniform and that has that system. And it kind of depends if you see your loyalty to your nation or to your state.
That's right. And it's another interesting point about it. So this is a slight, slight segue, but both parties take either side depending on, the extent to which it suits them. So, Republicans might seem, I suppose, closer to anti-federalists by today's standards, right? From a just sort of first glance.
Not on the military.
But take the idea, for example, of sanctuary states, sanctuary cities, right? So cities that in some sense defy federal immigration law. That's an anti-federalist. That's an anti-federalist position, right? Coming on the Democratic side. So, so it's a tension. The argument, I think, to get back to the present subject matter, you could say that what we're looking at is a tension in the system, and the tension is never resolved.
Yeah.
So it's true that the Federalists win. They have their way on this particular question, but the problem itself that they're debating is a problem that remains.
But that in itself is the thing, I think, with the Bill of Rights, because the Bill of Rights was fundamental. I don't think without the Bill of Rights it gets passed, but the Bill of Rights itself is quite vague, especially in its the clause on federal versus state, to the point where it has allowed the problem to pass, but has perpetuated it in the future. That American idea of we kick the can down the road and don't really deal with it.
Yeah. So James, should we just clarify? So what's the general thrust of the Bill of Rights? What's the motivation for putting it there?
Well, we did talk about it in one of the earlier podcasts, so we probably be
Ah,
repeating over the top of it. But like to bring it
okay.
back to recap on this one again, it was we looked at the amendments number first to the 10th Amendment about why they were set up and how they link to British rule or British perceived tyranny on the states. But I think it's that the key ones are the Ninth Amendment, which says made it clear that not all rights were necessarily defined in the Constitution, which then opens up a whole can of worms. And the 10th one made it clear that states retained any rights that were not specifically transferred to the federal government. That is
Yeah.
fundamentally problematic because
So
as a state modernizes, new problems are going to come in that are not specifically mentioned in a document that's 250 years old.
indeed, and so could you say that the general, just very generally, the general
Yeah.
motivation for the Bill of Rights is to give the states a kind of reassurance to
Yeah, I think
that
just not just the
that
states, but I think individual people. But I think, yeah, I think the idea was that they feared that the president, especially the role of the president, would become like the king. And they saw, because again, like I said, they saw the king as the defining power problem and not parliament. So they feared the executive and not legislative. And I think that's fundamentally where the crux comes in or where the fear and base was. But, tyranny in
and
America can come from any of the three branches of government.
but I think that I don't know, James. I might be inclined to disagree about that.
Yeah.
I think that the tensions leading up to the War of Independence between the American colonists and the British was really more of a fight between the American colonists and the British Parliament than it was with the King.
Yeah, it was in the
Um,
actuality,
and
as we talked
and
about
I
this,
think
what they saw
yeah,
it.
and I think that the Constitution also is suspicious, definitely suspicious of federal authority, although federal authority is pretty extensive at the same time, right? In
Yeah.
um, uh, but but it's also suspicious of the legislature. After all, the legislative branch is understood to be the supreme power of the land. It's not the president, and they divide it. They divide it between the Senate. They divide and the House of Representatives. They make elections very frequent. Um, and I think that that suggests that they're trying to, make legislation difficult, and
Yeah.
you need a considerable level of consensus in order
Yeah.
to get legislation through. And I think that reflects a suspicion not just of executive but also of legislative authority as well.
Yeah, I think fundamentally the American government is designed not to govern, but to not govern, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
It's designed for things not to happen. So if you think it was, if the irony is you think the Constitution is going to be designed to get a country to function, the American Constitution really is to stop things from happening unless they absolutely have to happen. So
that's
it's I
right.
think its fundamental position is as a handbrake, not an accelerator.
Yeah, with the additional with the caveat that once a law is passed, once a bill gets through, the executive should have the power to execute it. Right. So this is an argument that Hamilton makes about
Yeah.
executive authority in the Federalist Papers, is that one of the, and this comes from the problem with the Articles of Confederation, that the article the Continental Congress had the authority to do certain things, but it didn't have the power to do it.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's one of the things that the Constitution tries to remedy through a vigorous executive, I think, as Hamilton puts it. Okay, so anyway,
Yeah,
let's keep
Hamilton
going,
definitely
please.
wanted a stronger executive. I think that was his fundamental. I think Madison put the brakes on that a little bit. Hamilton would have had
Mm,
a stronger executive. There were quite a few who wanted a real strong executive in terms of like a king. And they wanted the Senate to be kind of like the House of Lords in England. They wanted an elite to run it, to maintain it, whereas the House of Representatives would be more populist. But that got eroded away as well eventually, or sort of. Well, now it's based around money. I mean, you could argue that all the time. The contemporary American system would be a whole other podcast.
yeah.
So if we're looking at the strong case, so you had three of the greatest minds, the greatest writers drafting the Federalist Papers, so that helps. And like most of the educated elites, most of the top intellectuals, most of the best writers, because they were worried. I know after Shays' rebellion, they were worried about, the fundamentals of their property, the real danger of a proper populist revolt, and they wanted to shut that down. So therefore, it was in their interest to create a system that would enable them to do that. I think that so the fact that all the educated and wealthiest people were behind it was significant, as was the fact that both Washington and Franklin supported it, because both, George Washington and Benjamin Franklin were by far the most influential colonists at that point. And I think their support made it much more acceptable to the public in general, and with the general idea that everyone kind of knew Washington would be the first president. So I think if they hadn't had lined up like someone with so much respect who they knew was unlikely to abuse that position, then I think it would have been a bit harder because he'd stepped away from leadership of the army, like we said before, like unlike Napoleon and unlike other leaders at this point who led democratic revolutions that turned into dictatorships. Washington did step away from the army, and I think fundamentally it also needed to solve the economic problem. I mean, the country was broken, so the Articles of Confederation wasn't working. As we looked at in the earlier essay, it couldn't deal with rebellions because they had no army. It couldn't deal with competition for British goods because they couldn't raise tariffs. It couldn't deal with international relations because they couldn't make treaties, and it couldn't pay its debts because it couldn't raise taxes, so it couldn't pay its former soldiers and farmers, which was leading to lots of the conflicts between debtors and creditors. So it was just the Articles of Federation was completely dysfunctional, and therefore, even if people didn't necessarily want what the Federalists were offering, I think it was clear to most people that something needed to change. What do you think?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think that's true with the again with what's interesting is the way that the Constitutional Convention functioned, because the expectation was not this constitution, right?
yeah.
It was meant to be some kind of revision of the Articles. So, let's take the counter argument to it for a second. Everyone can agree, Federalists as well as anti-Federalists as well, that the Articles of Confederation need to be improved. Does that mean you need a constant? Does that mean that you need a government along the lines that the Federalists were able to ram through necessarily?
I
Or are
mean,
there or are there some other, or are there intermediate positions? Is it possible, for example, to reform the Articles of Confederation to strengthen it without going the full,
maybe, but no one really made
the
that
full way?
case. You'd figured if there was like a groundswell of support for it, then it would have been put in. Because generally, my understanding is most of the anti-federalist campaigns, effectively, their real solution was stay with the Articles of Confederation. So the choice facing the country was really about: do we accept this new constitution or do we take the Articles of Federation?
Yeah.
It wasn't really a third way. I mean, I'm not saying there couldn't have been a third way designed, but there wasn't one on the table.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So it could have been a possibility, but for the nature of the argument, if you're a strong supporter of state rights, I guess you have less ability to unify than the Federalists do, to put together a really strong, um, consistent case, I guess.
Yeah, it's ironic because normally the ones who want to change things are divided in how they want to change it, and the ones who want to keep it the same are unified. But in this case,
I think it depends. Yeah, the anti-federalists are very. I mean, the anti-federalists are very, Brutus in the Federalist Papers. They are very coherent, and they do give some very good arguments. There, but okay, so and I think another thing to say about the limitations in this, what we're talking about is of course among the Federalists there are simmering divisions that are about to become exposed as soon as the Constitution is ratified. So it's not as if there's some kind of absolute consensus, even at this stage. I think it's more like an alliance of convenience.
Yeah.
Because some kind of constitution is better than the Articles of Confederation. So for the sake of argument, for the time being, we're going to unite our forces. But once that happens, things change very quickly. So I think that's a limitation.
And that's a nice segue because that leads to the third factor, which is compromises, and then probably the one you're going to go for. But I think all of these are, again, these essays are quite tight. I think you can argue any of the points because you can really make the case for all of them. But the compromises were fundamental to getting this through, as you said, because, and those divisions then were exposed. I mean, those divisions are still there today. I don't think they've even
Yeah,
gone. Like
sure.
even now in America, I think these divisions are still there. I think fundamentally from 1740 to today, you are still, I mean, this election of Trump versus Kamala is still the same divisions, the same fights, dressed up in different ways. So we talked about the Bill of Rights already as a factor of compromise. I don't think this gets passed without the Bill of Rights. I think that compromised to the states and to guarantee some protection of power was fundamental. Other compromises that were really key, the balance of power, as we talked about, the idea that there would be no one branch that runs it, so that the balance of power between the president, between Congress, and between the Supreme Court, all were equally positioned in a position of power. And the Bill of Rights then making sure that the Constitution is above those three, I think is fundamentally important. The Constitution is the highest law in the land. It's above all three of the branches of government. The compromise over slavery is vitally important as well. Without that compromise of the 3/5 vote, and without the idea that slavery wouldn't be mentioned in the Constitution, I don't think it would have gone through, because there's no way the North and South could have come to an agreement on anything to do with slavery, so they just glossed over it. The compromise of 1787 to stop states losing too much power, as Virginia had wanted to do, and the New Jersey proposal for small states with 2 representatives for the Senate and large states based on the population of the House of Representatives. I don't think without those compromises this gets passed. And that reinforces your idea that this was a marriage of convenience, but it was a very well put together marriage of convenience, at least
Very well.
to get the deal done.
Yeah, brilliant. It's a brilliant one. It's a brilliant one.
So which of
Yeah,
these three do you think is the most important? If you were asked, arguing this, which do you think is the main reason why the Federalists were able to get the Constitution ratified?
I'd be tempted to, well, it's kind of, I mean, yeah, I think a slight, maybe they're kind of apples and oranges, but I would say
Yeah.
that the fact that the compromise was so brilliant for
Yeah.
this, like to be able to balance the needs of larger states with smaller states, with the North and the South, with proponents of state rights, with proponents of strong federal government. All of this is, they managed to strike a balance with that, and I think that's fundamental for this to happen. So I guess I would, the fact that it's such a good compromise in a way makes it a strong case, right?
Yeah.
And maybe you need the genius of Hamilton, Madison, Jay to get to such a skillful compromise that you can make a very strong case for without energizing your enemies or your opponents to such an extent. You kind of take away their thunder by addressing their concerns.
Yeah. To
With
play
something
devil's
like the Bill of
advocate,
Rights. Yeah.
play devil's advocate now, I think you could argue that it was a strong case, because it was the fact they had such a strong case and they needed to fix it was why that led to the compromises. So without the strong case of the necessity, they wouldn't have made those compromises. Because if it wasn't that desperate, I don't think a lot of these groups would have made the compromises necessary to get it done.
Yeah, sure. I guess it
You equally
depends how
make
you
the
want to.
case for the poor campaign of the anti-federalists, because you equally flip it around and go, well, without the poor campaigning of the Federalists, if they'd have they only just got it over the line, even with all those compromises and even with a strong case, it almost failed. So if the anti-federalists had put together a more unified case, had put together a strong case, and had fought harder and had more people on their side, they would have been able to get it done, maybe.
Okay, yeah, you could make a case for that.
I think you can make a case for all three in this one. I think they all link together, obviously, and it's a question of which one is more fundamentally important. It's quite difficult to choose.
I think it's how you frame it.
Yeah, but they have to frame it. So if they get this question, they've got to run it. That's the key. So it's like, but this makes for interesting debates, because I think you can play around with these ones. I like Unit 4 because I think it's meaty. It's like Unit 2. I think Unit 1 and Unit 3 are pretty much are what they are. but these ones
Yeah.
allow a lot more room for debate, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
All right, so should we move on to it? So now we've got a constitution, we can move on to the next question, which is how well did the first government in the USA in 1789 deal with the problems it faced? So this is obviously comparable to this is obviously now, how did they deal with problems comparative to the Articles of Confederation? I think I'll just run a brief recap of the Articles of Federation, the fact that obviously they'd failed with Shays' Rebellion. So Shays' Rebellion had been, again, because the government was unable to pay the farmers who'd fought in the war, they rebelled up. They were having they couldn't pay their debts. They wanted printed money. The merchants didn't want printed money because they couldn't pay the debts. They seized the farms. The seizure of the farms led to the farmers rebelling, marching on the courthouse. There was no national army to put it down. So wealthy merchants had to raise up a force. And this exposed the fact that, again, they had no taxation powers to pay for stuff or do anything. We looked at how financially they were struggling to pay off their debt from the war and to pay off other things because they couldn't raise taxes. They had no army, no ability to pay taxes, no ability to raise tariffs, and fundamentally no ability to make foreign treaties. So now they've got all these powers. The main point of the new constitution was it gave the federal government these powers and only really these powers. Because again, they didn't really want to give apart from the looseness of the federal government could then take powers, which over the last 250 years it has used to take on a lot more powers it's originally given. It's basically had the powers it required to deal with stuff. And then the key is, did it then, the new government under Washington, deal with problems better than the Articles of Confederation did? So I've broken it down into establishing a government that could deal with problems, economics, and westward expansion. I mean, you can pick a million different categories for this essay, I think, to bring it down, but I'll start with these ones and I'll break it down. So I'll start with establishing a government that could deal with problems. So what were the positives? Well, the Bill of Rights reassured the people. So I think that's fundamentally important. So Madison got the Bill of Rights drafted, he got it passed. And I think that reassured the people that there would be no tyrannical government. So I think that was really fundamentally important. And without it, I think it wouldn't have got ratified. George Washington had credibility as the first leader. Obviously, he'd been the leader of the army during the war. He'd won it. He'd stepped down from his military posts. He was probably the most highly regarded of all Americans. And I don't think this first government succeeds as well. And we'll talk about that in the last essay with anyone else other than George Washington leading it. And by the way, if you want to jump in, jump in.
Yeah, I mean, I think Washington's not a genius in the sense he wasn't a great intellectual. He lost, he basically lost all the battles that he fought, right? Yeah. But he was kind of a genius in one respect, and that was to be able to be venerated and respected by all sides of the political aisle, right? He had credibility. He wasn't a partisan. He didn't seem to have, selfish ambition. He really was a kind of great figurehead to have in the executive for the first presidency. I think he's remarkable in that respect.
Yeah,
that he's able to unify. He's able to be a unifying figure. He's able to, deal with Hamilton on the one hand, Jefferson, Madison on the other, as the kind of, ultimate arbiter, the judge, the authority that all of these very intelligent, but also, these men have their own very particular ideas about how government should work. Washington's able to kind of provide the unifying factor, let's say. I think that's where Washington's genius lies.
I think that he's also, because he's not a great thinker, he doesn't really have an ideology. He's a pragmatist. So I think that because he doesn't have to die on his principles, I think that allows him to manage these colossal egos inside his cabinet and inside his inner circle that and like I said, when we deal with the essay of why it was hard to replace him, I just don't think anyone had that role. I mean, I remember reading their diaries at university when I was studying this, and Adams and Jefferson are all talking about these fundamental rights of man and the ideas behind the Constitution and everything. And I read George Washington's diary, and it's like, yeah, I went out hunting today, shot a couple of rabbits. There's all this talk about my country rebelling, but I don't think anything's going to happen. It's just like completely, I don't care about any of these things. So,
Yeah, I think that's right. And of course, the fact that Washington he leaves office voluntarily.
Yeah.
In the style of, there's a Roman emperor called Cincinnatus,
mm-hmm.
who was famous for giving up the purple and going back to his farm.
Yeah.
Right, to run his farm after he'd done his service to the empire. I think that Washington kind of reminds you of that kind of heroic, selfless service to the republic.
Yeah, and he cultivated that image. Like he knew his reputation, his honor, his everything was really fundamentally important. I think he was fundamental. I mean, obviously for the Americans, they saw themselves as the heirs to the Roman Empire as well in their resurrection of the republic. So into the classics, they look back to that time as well. So I think like Washington fundamentally in that position was really important. And talking about his positions, I mean, he appointed Hamilton as the Secretary of the Treasury and Jefferson as Secretary of State. So two great rivals. I don't know how much rivals they were before and whether it became it from their roles and obviously their attempts to influence and do stuff. But he had two colossal egos that ended up forming that really represented the two divides in the country. Like Definitely. Hamilton and Jefferson were clear representatives of the two divides in the country at the time. And I think Washington's ability to handle that. And then also the other architect of the Federalist Papers, John Jay, was appointed as Supreme Court Justice. So,
I think I just want to add two things. The first is that the first president, because all of this is relatively new, Washington is going to set the precedent for, the kind of institutional precedent for future presidents. So that's very important, right? So, and then the second thing is, I think actually Hamilton has the upper hand. So it's not quite neutral. I think that Hamilton's fortunes are still, are still waxing under Washington. I think, things become very difficult for Hamilton once Washington leaves office. Hamilton definitely is very disappointed when Washington decides to leave.
Well, Washington saw Hamilton and Lafayette as like surrogate sons, I think. So he's almost like the son.
It's not. I don't think it's quite equal, is it?
No,
I'm not sure. But
no,
but you could say that the conflict is contained.
Yes,
for the time being.
Yeah, because there's someone above it, and the problem when Washington goes is everyone else is on one side or the other. There is not a single person who's not on one side or other than Washington.
Yeah. This leads to another really interesting issue, which is that the one thing that the framers of the Constitution don't really talk about is parties.
Yeah,
because they didn't really want them. They understood they understood them as factions, I think.
Yeah,
and factions are bad, right? Factions.
Well, they saw them as the death of democracy because your loyalty would be to your party over your country, and that's obviously clear in today's life.
Yeah, no, I mean, so these were very smart men. It's not that there wouldn't be factions. There would be factions, of course, but there wouldn't be, interests would be divided to an extent